actually would have more information than the ISP would. Furthermore, ISPs, we're no longer in a world where people access the internet only from home via their home ISP. The average consumer uses 6.1 devices to connect to the internet, bizarrely, and most consumers are using 3 to 5 different internet access providers to connect to the internet every day. So the single home ISP, for example, does not have a unique view of a huge amount of user activity. And if you consider that, and think about it, if you take your smartphone, you connect to Wi-Fi, which 46 mobile users are doing for their internet traffic, that information is going through a Wi-Fi provider. If you access the internet from home, you will typically have a home internet provider. If you access information on your mobile device when you're not connected to Wi-Fi, your wireless provider will be collecting information. And then your work ISP provider, whoever's providing broadband service at the office, will also potentially collect some information. But this is a much more fragmented universe with much of the data encrypted, so the ISP can't see it anyway.
That particular study has been disputed by a number of people recently. I think it's about 65% of the data right now is unencrypted, and that's talking about, yes, the content of what's going over. But what's just as significant and just as revealing is the information of what site you went to and how long you were there, and sort of tracking, the types of sites that you visit, and then having ads targeted on the basis of that sort of information. It is correct that the current rules that apply to common carriers were from the world of telephones, and they aren't adequate and really don't correctly categorize the kinds of information that should come under the FC privacy rules with broadband access providers. And that's what this rulemaking is all about, is trying to figure out which things are in fact what's known as CPNI, which is customer proprietary network information. That's the data that you gather simply by virtue of someone plugging into your network. And the idea is that you ought not to be able to use that data for purposes other than completing the network transaction unless the person gives permission for that to happen. It works in the telephone world, and it should work the same way in the broadband internet access providing world.
For the average subscriber, why should he care about that information? Are there ways in which the carriers, the ISPs, are monetizing or using this data that's raising concerns?
Yeah,
for
I think right now, you get that data. A profile can be put together about you, and you can then be sort of targeted for kinds of advertising that can end up being discriminatory and taking advantage of you in ways that probably aren't entirely fair. And while it is true that the internet is more than just the internet access providers, they are in a unique position in terms of you pretty much have to go through one, and it's appropriate, because they are unique, to recognize that and deal with the data that they gather. And we can talk about other questions around the so-called edge providers, the Googles, the Facebooks, and all that. And I believe there should be some rules put in place there. But that's not the subject of this particular FCC provision at this point.
Jim Halpert.
Well, I think you do need to look at the internet ecosystem as a whole. It is, first of all, for the reasons I described, it's not true that ISPs have a uniquely broad view of user behavior. There's also no indication that I've read of that ISPs are analyzing all the unencrypted traffic that goes through their network and all the places where users are going. But even if that were the case, that is exactly what internet advertising business models do today. And it's not particularly harmful. It's essentially presenting ads that you may be interested in based on where you're going on the internet. And how the ad-supported free internet works today, the ISPs are tiny players in the world of internet advertising. There are strong self-regulatory requirements that ISPs and others in this ecosystem have all made to follow privacy opt-out rules in a variety of ways that give consumers notice and control. Those are absolutely enforceable today. There's nothing that would change that. They're binding commitments. And to break off this what's today a tiny piece of the internet advertising ecosystem and subjecting it to rigorous rules that consumers won't understand and ignore the whole rest of the internet ecosystem is not really a rational approach to privacy on the internet. The fact is that given the way that Congress is configured right now and the House of Representatives is likely to remain under pretty libertarian Republican control for at least 6 years and probably another 10 after that, it's virtually certain that there will be no general privacy legislation that applies to the internet. There would just be this one odd, tiny little piece of the internet ecosystem that would be subject to potentially very confusing rules. What consumers want, I think, and expect is to have choices about how their information is used, to have clear, transparent notice about information practices, and to have an easy way to opt out of practices that they don't want to see being done with their data. But moving to an opt-in privacy rule, which is effectively what John's advocating for, is really quite different. If you think about what happens with your health information, for example, when you go to a doctor, you have to sign a form, a privacy form, every single time you go to a different doctor. And effectively, that's what would be happening with Internet access service for information to be used for any purpose other than delivery of service or improving service, I think, under John's proposal. But, John, I'm curious what you and the other privacy groups have put forward.
I think that's what we're essentially suggesting. We think that with the ISPs, that indeed, before they can use the information for purposes other than providing the service, that it should be an opt-in sort of situation. And you know, that's part of the problem right now with the internet. You talk about all these self-regulatory regimes and so on, and they're based on the so-called notice and choice model, where they explain it in a privacy policy, and then people say, "Oh, okay, that's fine," and that doesn't work because of the fact of the matter. Who around this table, when was the last time anyone read a privacy policy? Except maybe you, because you're a lawyer who writes them, and you get paid by the word to write them and make them.
No, I don't get paid by the word.
Sometimes they read that.
I also read them as a consumer.
I was going to say, my standard line is they read like they're written by lawyers who are paid by the word to obfuscate the situation. I mean, privacy policies are not
that we
clear.
worked together on it and an effort to simplify privacy.
We did. Yes, we did. I agree, and it was fun.
Right now we're in the last year of an administration, and right now the FCC is looking at approving just a proposal, right? So what's the likelihood that they're going to be able to get put out the NPRM, the notice of proposed rulemaking, and get back all the comments they need to get back, and then still get a final rule and get that in place by the end of this administration?
I think it will be very interesting to see if they can. I think it's important that they do the notice of public rulemaking as soon as they possibly can, and we expect quite soon. And that, if nothing else, raises all the questions and gets a record going where people can put in their various views and their various concerns. And if they can come back fast enough with a new rule, that'd be great. But it can also serve as a foundation for what goes on with the next commission and the next administration.
Well, there's also a contingency here, which is that the underlying net neutrality order, which created this particular problem, it may have solved other problems, but it created this regulatory gap, may not be upheld in its entirety. So there's a decent chance that wireless providers will be, in the end, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals is reviewing a challenge to that order, and there is a pretty good chance that wireless providers may be ruled to be outside of the